Yo, what's popping, Jimbos? This is going to be another game mechanics video, and it's going to be about wall blocking. Before we get to what wall blocking is and how to perform it, it's worth mentioning a little bit about mob behavior and why wall blocking is even used in the first place. In Underworld, as well as other speed clears, the most efficient way of killing enemies is by the use of AoE damaging skills, such as Wastrels, Whirling, or Voss. Dealing AoE type of damage to melee enemies causes some of them to scatter, which in result makes them difficult to kill. Wall blocking prevents that from happening, allowing the player to smoothly and quickly kill balls of enemies. What is scattering exactly? Scattering is a mob behavior that makes enemies stop attacking the player and run away from him instead, in an attempt to avoid taking further damage. All but 3 of the melee enemies taking damage will scatter and position themselves at around 90% of the player's aggro bubble range and slightly diagonally to the right. Even if the player moves, the enemies will follow him, but stick to their preferred position and keep distance as shown in the video. They'll remain in that position until they regenerate their health back to around 90%. Once they do, they'll come back and start attacking you again. Enemies scatter at different times based on the player's movement. When the player tanking the enemies is standing still, scattering occurs only when the HP of the enemies goes below around 66% of their maximum health. When the player tanking the enemies is moving, however, the enemies will scatter as soon as their HP drops below 100%. And that's exactly why, as T2, you're not supposed to use Whirling on duo pull in chamber. Now that we know how and when scattering happens, let's move on to how to prevent it. Wall blocking is one of the most basic techniques used by tanks in Terras to prevent groups of melee enemies from scattering. The result of a successful right wall block is that enemies attempting to scatter will get stuck at the player's position instead, neither attacking nor running away. There's a few requirements that have to be met in order for the wall block to work properly. Here they are. When facing the enemies, the terrain on which you'll be blocking them has to be on your character's right hand side. The enemies have to be directly touching the wall, otherwise they might run away from you. Here's a step-by-step presentation of a successful wall block. First, I position all the enemies so they're attacking me from the same direction. I do that by letting them catch up to me as I walk towards the wall I'll be blocking them on. Next, I walk alongside of that wall, making them align against it. Lastly, I take a tiny step away from the wall to ensure that none of the enemies will be able to run around me on the left side. Only when all the conditions are met, I stop and start dealing AoE damage, knowing that they won't scatter. Here are some examples of me performing a wall block at normal speed, so you can see how it looks in practice. Even though the general rule is to always use a wall block when killing enemies with AoE damage, there's an exception to this rule. The only case in which you don't need to perform a wall block is when a group of enemies consists of 3 or less entities and does not include a glitched mob. Only then enemies don't scatter when taking AoE damage. In Underworld, this situation might occur, for example, when killing smites and wastes, or when killing single groups of graspings in lab. With more experience, you'll be able to bend some of these rules without bearing the consequences of a failed wall block, like for example here. Even though the collector on the left is clearly not wall blocked, he dies before he can even run away after getting below 66% health. Despite it working in that case, I still recommend adjusting the wall block every time. It will ensure that the enemies won't scatter, and you'll avoid situations like this. Here is a similar situation, but with adjusting the wall block before dealing AoE damage. There's a clear difference. Even if your wall block doesn't work out perfectly and some enemies run away from you, there is a way to make them come back into the ball without having to wait for them to regenerate to full HP. In other words, now I'm going to show you how to fix a failed wall block. The first way to do this is by auto-attacking the enemy or enemies that run away with a ranged weapon, like a staff or a bow. Once the enemy comes back into the ball, you can readjust the wall block to prevent him from leaving again. You can also continue auto-attacking said enemy, that will also keep him locked onto you. The second way to make enemies come back into the ball after they've scattered is to move away from their comfort zone. By touching the wall, like to perform a right wall block, and walking back alongside of it, you force the enemies to chase after you. Because they want to stay diagonally to the right of you, they end up running into melee range because that's as close to being in their comfort position as they're going to get. Important note, the enemies will run into the ball only after they've reached the edge of your aggro bubble. They don't like being further away than 90% of your aggro bubble, and that's why they run in closer. That will be it for this video. As always, thanks for watching. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments or message me in game. Special thanks to Flamsy. You can expect some new videos coming to my channel in the near future. But for now, see ya until then.